There is a boundary in the rock record of the Earth, a thin layer of stone found in cliff faces and road cuts and canyon walls on every continent that marks one of the most significant transitions in the history of life on this planet. Below that layer, the fossils tell one story. Above it, they tell another. Below, there are the bones and teeth of creatures that had dominated the land for more than 160 million years. Above, those creatures are entirely absent, replaced over time by the descendants of much smaller animals that had lived in the shadows of the great reptiles for all those millions of years. This boundary, called the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, marks the end of one world and the quiet beginning of another. The story of what happened at that boundary, of what ended the long reign of the non-avian dinosaurs and reshaped the biological communities of the entire planet, is one of the most carefully studied questions in the history of paleontology and geology. It is a story that has been assembled slowly over many decades of research, from evidence found in the rock record, in chemical signatures preserved in ancient sediments, in the fossils of the animals that died and the animals that survived, and in the geological record of an event so powerful that its traces are readable in rock formations across the entire globe. The story of the dinosaurs' end cannot be understood without first understanding the world in which they lived, the long history of the Mesozoic era that preceded the boundary, and the nature of the animals and ecosystems that were present when the Great Transition occurred. The dinosaurs were not simply large reptiles that happened to be present when something terrible happened. They were the products of more than 200 million years of evolution, deeply integrated into the ecosystems of the Mesozoic world, diverse and successful in ways that are sometimes underappreciated by those who know them only as the large, spectacular forms that dominate popular understanding. To appreciate what was lost at the end of the Cretaceous, it is helpful to begin even further back at the beginning of the Mesozoic era itself, and to trace the long history of the dinosaur lineage through the ages that preceded its abrupt and partial end. The Mesozoic era began approximately 252 million years ago. At the boundary between the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras, a boundary marked by the most severe mass extinction in the history of complex animal life. This end-Permian extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying, eliminated perhaps 90 to 96% of all marine species and a significant proportion of land species as well, leaving behind a world greatly impoverished in its biological diversity. The causes of the end-Permian extinction are themselves a subject of ongoing research, but they appear to have involved massive volcanic activity in what is now Siberia, the eruption of enormous quantities of lava and volcanic gases that altered the chemistry of both the atmosphere and the ocean in ways that were lethal to most of the living things that had populated the Paleozoic world. And the recovery from the end-Permian extinction was slow, measured in millions of years rather than thousands, as the surviving lineages gradually diversified and filled the ecological roles that had been emptied by the extinction. The Triassic period, the first of the three periods of the Mesozoic era, was a time of recovery and reorganization, of new groups rising to prominence in the emptied world, experimenting with new body forms and new ecological strategies. Among the groups that emerged and diversified during the Triassic were the archosaurs, a broad lineage of reptiles that would prove enormously successful across the Mesozoic, eventually giving rise to both the dinosaurs and their close relatives, the crocodilians, as well as to the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that shared the Mesozoic skies with the early birds. Thus, the earliest dinosaurs appeared during the Middle Triassic period, approximately 230 to 240 million years ago, in what is now South America. These early dinosaurs were not the enormous creatures that would eventually come to define the popular image of the group. They were small to medium-sized animals, perhaps 1 to 4 meters in length, bipedal or capable of moving both on 2 legs and on 4, and likely omnivorous or carnivorous in their dietary habits. They were not immediately dominant in the ecosystems of the early Triassic. Other archosaur groups, including the Eddosaurs and the Rauisuchians, were also present and were in some cases larger and more abundant. The dominance of the dinosaurs over the other archosaur groups of the Triassic appears to have been established gradually, over a period of tens of millions of years, rather than through an immediate competitive victory. The end of the Triassic period, approximately 201 million years ago, brought another significant extinction event, the end-Triassic extinction, which eliminated many of the non-dinosaurian archosaurs and cleared ecological space that the dinosaurs were well positioned to fill in the subsequent Jurassic period. The Jurassic period, lasting from approximately 201 million to approximately 145 million years ago, was the time in which the dinosaurs truly diversified and came to dominate the terrestrial ecosystems of the world. The great sauropods, the long-necked herbivores that grew to the largest body sizes ever achieved by land animals, became abundant during the Jurassic. The theropod dinosaurs, the bipedal predators, diversified into a wide range of sizes and ecological roles. The ornithischian dinosaurs, including the ancestors of the later horned and armored and duck-billed forms of the Cretaceous, were also present and beginning to diversify. The world of the Jurassic was different from the world of the later Cretaceous in important ways. The continents were arranged differently, still close enough together in some cases for land animals to move between what would eventually become separate land masses. The climate was warm, with no polar ice caps, and the average temperature was higher than the present by several degrees. Dense coniferous forests and fern-dominated ground vegetation covered much of the land. The dinosaurs that inhabited this world ranged from the colossal, like the great sauropods such as Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus, to the tiny, like the small feathered theropods that were already in the process of giving rise to the birds. The transition from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous, approximately 145 million years ago, did not involve a major extinction, but rather a gradual shift in the composition of dinosaurian communities. The great sauropods of the Jurassic declined in diversity in some regions, while new groups diversified. The most significant developments of the Cretaceous included the radiation of the flowering plants, the angiosperms, which diversified explosively during the Cretaceous and eventually came to dominate most terrestrial plant communities, and the corresponding diversification of the plant-eating dinosaurs, particularly the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, whose dental adaptations allowed them to process the tough vegetation of the angiosperm-dominated landscape. The Cretaceous period, lasting from approximately 145 million to 66 million years ago, represents the final chapter of the Mesozoic era and the final flourishing of the non-avian dinosaurs. It was a long period, spanning nearly 80 million years, during which the dinosaurs continued to diversify and to dominate the terrestrial ecosystems of the world. The iconic dinosaurs of popular understanding Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops, and Ankylosaurus and the hadrosaurs, all lived during the late Cretaceous in the final 20 million years or so of the period. The world of the late Cretaceous was in many ways a world of considerable biological richness. The dinosaurian communities of North America and Asia are particularly well known from the fossil record because the sedimentary rocks of the late Cretaceous in those regions have been extensively studied. A typical late Cretaceous ecosystem in North America might have included large theropod predators such as Tyrannosaurus and its relatives, large herds of hadrosaurs and ceratopsians feeding on the abundant vegetation, smaller herbivores including the ankylosaurs with their body armor and tail clubs, and a variety of smaller animals including small theropod dinosaurs, birds, lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodilians, small mammals, and many invertebrates. The dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous were not, as was once sometimes assumed, declining or deteriorating as a group in the millions of years before the end Cretaceous extinction. The fossil record of the latest Cretaceous, while showing some changes in the composition of dinosaurian communities, does not clearly show a long-term trend of decline in diversity or abundance. The non-avian dinosaurs appear to have been a successful and diverse group of animals right up to the end of the Cretaceous period, which makes the abruptness and completeness of their disappearance from the fossil record above the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary all the more striking. The Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, often abbreviated as the KPG boundary, using the German spelling of Cretaceous, is recognizable in many rock sequences around the world by a thin layer, often just a centimeter or two in thickness, that is enriched in the element iridium. Iridium is a rare element in the Earth's crust, but it is relatively more abundant in extraterrestrial materials, including meteorites. The discovery of this iridium-rich layer at the KPG boundary and rock sections across multiple continents in the late 1970s was one of the pivotal moments in the scientific understanding of the end Cretaceous extinction because it provided a chemical signature linking the extinction event to an extraterrestrial cause. The researchers who first described the iridium anomaly at the KPG boundary, the physicist Luis Alvarez and his son, the geologist Walter Alvarez, along with their colleagues Frank Asaro and Helen Michel, proposed in a paper published in 1980 that the iridium enrichment was the result of the impact of a large asteroid or comet with the Earth. They calculated that the quantity of iridium in the boundary layer was consistent with the vaporization of an extraterrestrial body approximately 10 kilometers in diameter. And they proposed that the impact of such a body would have caused environmental disruptions of sufficient severity to explain the end Cretaceous mass extinction. This hypothesis, which became known as the impact hypothesis, was initially controversial among paleontologists and geologists, many of whom were skeptical that a single catastrophic event could explain the extinction of an enormously diverse group of organisms spread across the entire globe. The controversy stimulated a great deal of research over the following decades as scientists examined the evidence at the KPG boundary in detail, looked for the crater that the impact would have left, and investigated the mechanism by which an impact could have caused a global mass extinction. The search for the impact crater was eventually successful. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, researchers investigating the geological structure of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and the adjacent seafloor identified a large circular geological structure centered on the town of Chicxulub, which was recognized as the remnant of a very large impact crater. The Chicxulub crater, as it came to be known, is approximately 150 to 180 kilometers in diameter, making it one of the largest confirmed impact craters on Earth. Its age, determined by a variety of radiometric dating methods, corresponds precisely to the age of the KPG boundary, approximately 66 million years ago. The identification of the Chicxulub crater as the site of the KPG impact was a major confirmation of the Alvarez impact hypothesis, and in the decades since the crater's identification, extensive research has characterized its structure and the sequence of events that its formation represents. The impactor that created the Chicxulub crater was a rocky or possibly partially carbonaceous body approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, traveling at a velocity of perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers per second relative to the Earth's surface when it struck. The energy released by the impact was enormous, equivalent to billions of times the energy of the largest nuclear weapons ever built, far beyond any scale of human experience. The immediate effects of the impact were severe on a regional scale. The area of the Yucatan Peninsula and the surrounding region would have experienced intense heat, tremendous blast effects, enormous tsunamis radiating outward from the impact site, and the ejection of vast quantities of material from the crater into the atmosphere. Some of this ejected material, after being thrown high into the atmosphere and even into orbit, would have fallen back to Earth across the entire globe, heating the upper atmosphere as it re-entered and causing wildfires across wide areas of land. But the most important effects of the impact on the extinction of the dinosaurs and other organisms were not the immediate regional effects, severe as those were, but the global atmospheric effects that persisted for months to years after the impact. The vaporization of the impactor and of the target rocks of the Yucatan, which were rich in sulfur-bearing minerals called gypsum and anhydrite, released enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide and other aerosol-forming compounds into the upper atmosphere. The impact also lofted enormous quantities of fine dust and soot from global wildfires into the stratosphere. These aerosols and dust particles in the upper atmosphere blocked and scattered incoming solar radiation, reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface to a fraction of normal levels. The result was a dramatic cooling of the Earth's surface, sometimes described as an impact winter, during which photosynthesis was severely curtailed or entirely halted across large areas of the globe. The cooling may have been followed by a period of warming as the sulfur aerosols were removed from the atmosphere more quickly than the carbon dioxide released by the impact and the wildfires. The disruption of photosynthesis was the mechanism through which the impact's effects propagated through the food webs of the world's ecosystems. Photosynthesis is the foundation of almost all terrestrial and marine food chains. Plants capture solar energy and convert it to organic matter, which is consumed by herbivores, which are in turn consumed by carnivores. When photosynthesis fails, the entire food chain collapses from the bottom upward, with the effects felt most immediately by those organisms most dependent on a continuous supply of plant material, and eventually by all organisms in the chain, including the top predators. From the selectivity of the end Cretaceous extinction, the pattern of which groups survived and which did not, is broadly consistent with this food chain collapse mechanism. Large, warm-blooded animals that required large quantities of food to sustain themselves were among the most vulnerable, because the collapse of plant productivity would have rapidly depleted the food resources available to both large herbivores and the large carnivores that depended on them. The non-avian dinosaurs, as the dominant large-bodied animals of the late Cretaceous terrestrial ecosystems, were particularly vulnerable to this kind of disruption. The survival pattern at the end of the Cretaceous is instructive. Among the animals that survived were small mammals, most of which were probably omnivorous or insectivorous, and therefore less dependent on a continuous supply of fresh plant material. The birds, or avian dinosaurs, mostly survived, though with significant losses, possibly because their small body size, varied diets, and ability to eat seeds and dormant plant material allowed them to persist through the period of reduced productivity. Crocodilians survived, possibly because they were semi-aquatic and could sustain themselves on aquatic food chains that were somewhat less severely disrupted than terrestrial ones, and because they had low metabolic rates that allowed them to survive extended periods of food scarcity. Turtles and lizards and snakes survived in various groups, again likely related to their low metabolic requirements and dietary flexibility, while the marine realm experienced equally severe disruptions, though the pattern of extinctions was somewhat different from that on land. The marine extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was severe at certain levels of the food chain, particularly among the photosynthetic organisms of the surface ocean, the phytoplankton, which were directly affected by the reduction in solar radiation reaching the sea surface. The collapse of phytoplankton productivity propagated upward through the marine food chain, affecting the zooplankton that fed on phytoplankton, the fish and other organisms that fed on zooplankton, and the large marine predators at the top of the marine food web. The ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that had been a prominent feature of marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years, went extinct at the KPG boundary. The mosasaurs, the large predatory marine lizards that had dominated the open ocean during the late Cretaceous, also disappeared entirely. The plesiosaurs, another group of large marine reptiles, similarly vanished. The marine communities above the KPG boundary are strikingly different from those below it, a difference visible not only in the fossils of large animals, but in the microscopic remains of the calcareous organisms that form the basis of many deep-sea sediments. The evidence from the KPG boundary, assembled over the decades since the Alvarez hypothesis was first proposed, has established the reality of the impact at Chicxulub and its role as the primary cause of the end Cretaceous mass extinction to the satisfaction of the overwhelming majority of researchers in the relevant fields. But the story of what really killed the dinosaurs is not simply the story of the Chicxulub impact in isolation. It is a more complex story that involves other significant geological events occurring at the same time, as well as the longer-term changes in the Mesozoic world that had been occurring across millions of years before the impact. Understanding the full picture requires looking at both the immediate catastrophe and the longer context in which it occurred. The most significant of the other geological events contemporaneous with the KPG impact is the eruption of the Deccan Traps, a massive episode of flood volcanism in what is now the Deccan Plateau of India. The Deccan Traps represent one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the Earth, involving the eruption of enormous quantities of basaltic lava over a period of perhaps 1 to 2 million years, centered on approximately 66 million years ago. The total volume of lava erupted during the Deccan episode is estimated at approximately 1 to 2 million cubic kilometers, a quantity sufficient to cover the entire surface of the Earth to a depth of several meters. The volcanic gases released during the Deccan eruptions, particularly sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, would have had significant effects on the global climate and on the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean. Sulfur dioxide, when released into the atmosphere in large quantities, forms sulfate aerosols that reflect incoming solar radiation and cause short-term cooling, similar to the effects of the impact. But carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that contributes to warming over longer timescales. The cycling between these cooling and warming effects, produced by repeated large eruptions over hundreds of thousands of years, would have created a period of significant climate instability in the centuries and millennia around the end of the Cretaceous. The relationship between the Deccan Traps eruptions and the KPG impact is a subject of ongoing research. Recent studies have suggested that the Chicxulub impact may have influenced the Deccan eruptions, with the seismic energy generated by the impact potentially triggering or accelerating volcanic activity on the other side of the planet. Whether or not this relationship is confirmed by further research, the coincidence of a massive extraterrestrial impact and one of the largest episodes of flood volcanism in Earth history at the same time in geological record is a striking feature of the end Cretaceous story, and both events may have contributed to the environmental stress that produced the mass extinction. The relative contributions of the impact and the Deccan volcanism to the end Cretaceous extinction have been debated and continue to be discussed among researchers. The general consensus, supported by the pattern and timing of the extinctions in the fossil record, is that the Chicxulub impact was the primary cause of the extinction, producing an abrupt and severe environmental disruption that was the immediate cause of the collapse of the global food web. The Deccan eruptions may have contributed to environmental stress in the period leading up to and following the impact, making the world's ecosystems somewhat more vulnerable than they would otherwise have been, and possibly prolonging the period of environmental disruption after the impact. The details of this story, the precise sequence of events at the boundary, the duration of the impact winter, the recovery of productivity after the disruption, and the relative roles of different environmental stresses are matters that continue to be refined as new techniques are applied to the boundary record and as new fossil sites are discovered and analyzed. The study of the KPG boundary is an active field of research, and the understanding of what happened 66 million years ago continues to develop. Before moving on to the more detailed examination of the events at the boundary and their consequences, it is worth spending some time with the longer context of the late Cretaceous world, the changes that had been occurring in the millions of years before the impact, and the question of whether the non-avian dinosaurs were already experiencing any degree of ecological or evolutionary stress before the boundary event. The late Cretaceous, particularly the final stage known as the Maastrichtian, lasting from approximately 72 to 66 million years ago, was a time of significant environmental change. Sea levels, which had been among the highest in the history of the Phanerozoic during the earlier Cretaceous, were gradually declining during the Maastrichtian. As tectonic activity changed the volume of the mid-ocean ridge systems that had previously displaced large quantities of seawater onto the continental shelves. This sea level decline caused the retreat of the shallow, warm epicontinental seas that had covered large areas of the continents during the earlier Cretaceous, exposing new land but also eliminating the distinctive communities of organisms that had inhabited those shallow seas. The climate of the Maastrichtian was also changing, with a general trend toward cooling from the warmer conditions of the earlier Cretaceous. The warm, equable climate of the earlier Cretaceous, with its lack of polar ice caps and its relatively modest temperature difference between the tropics and the poles, was giving way to a cooler, more seasonally variable climate. With evidence for the development of seasonal ice at the poles in some analyses of the Maastrichtian climate record. These changes would have affected the distribution of vegetation and the patterns of food availability for herbivorous dinosaurs and their dependents. The question of whether these environmental changes had caused any decline in dinosaurian diversity or abundance in the final millions of years before the boundary has been examined carefully by researchers using data from the most fossiliferous latest Cretaceous formations. The results of these studies have been somewhat mixed, with some analyses finding evidence for a decline in dinosaurian diversity in the final millions of years before the boundary, and others finding no clear trend. The difficulty of interpreting such analyses is that the quality of the fossil record varies considerably from one time interval to another, and apparent changes in diversity may reflect changes in the quality of the record rather than changes in the actual diversity of the living fauna. The most recent and most carefully conducted analyses of the latest Cretaceous dinosaur record suggest that while there may have been some changes in the composition of dinosaurian communities in the final millions of years before the boundary, there is no clear evidence of a sustained, widespread decline in dinosaurian diversity that would explain or predict the complete disappearance of the group. The non-avian dinosaurs were still a diverse and ecologically dominant group of animals at the very end of the Cretaceous, and the abruptness of their disappearance from the fossil record at the KPG boundary remains the most striking feature of their extinction. This first part of the account has established the broad context, the long history of the dinosaurs through the Mesozoic, the world in which they lived at the end of the Cretaceous, and the discovery and characterization of the Chicxulub impact and its role in the end Cretaceous mass extinction. The story continues in the next part, where the focus turns to the specific mechanisms by which the impact and the associated environmental disruptions caused the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs and so many other organisms, and to the pattern of survival and recovery that followed the extinction event. The rock layers record it all in their patient way. Below the boundary, the world of the dinosaurs. Not above, the world that followed, and in between, that thin layer of altered chemistry, the boundary itself, marking the moment when one great chapter of the history of life on Earth came to its end. The thin layer of rock that marks the Cretaceous-Paleogen boundary is, in a sense, one of the most information-rich objects in the geological record. Its precise chemical composition, the types of minerals it contains, the microscopic textures of the particles within it, all of these properties carry encoded information about the events of 66 million years ago, information that researchers have spent decades learning to read. Understanding what that layer says about the events at the boundary requires looking at the evidence from multiple directions, from the chemistry of the iridium and other elements enriched in the layer, from the tiny glassy spherules called microtectites that formed when rock was vaporized by the impact and then solidified in the atmosphere, from the shocked quartz grains whose internal crystal structure was deformed by the enormous pressures of the impact, and from the carbon and sulfur isotope signatures that record changes in the global carbon cycle and in atmospheric chemistry at the boundary. The shocked quartz grains found in the KPG boundary layer are among the most unambiguous indicators of an extraterrestrial impact. Quartz, The common silicate mineral found in many rocks can be deformed by the enormous pressures generated during a hypervelocity impact in a way that leaves distinctive planar deformation features, microscopic planes of amorphous glass within the crystal, visible under a petrographic microscope. The pressures required to produce these features in quartz, many gigapascals, are far beyond anything achievable by ordinary geological processes, including volcanism, and shocked quartz is therefore considered a reliable indicator of impact. The presence of shocked quartz in the KPG boundary layer at sites around the world was one of the early confirmations of the impact hypothesis, and its distribution provides information about the direction of ejection of material from the Chicxulub crater. The microtectites and tektite-like spherules in the boundary layer are equally informative. When a large impact melts and vaporizes rock, some of the melt is ejected into the atmosphere and even beyond it, and as these molten droplets cool and solidify, they form small glassy spheres or other shapes that fall back to Earth and are preserved in the boundary layer. The composition of the spherules in the KPG boundary matches the composition of the target rocks at Chicxulub, providing a direct chemical link between the boundary layer materials and the impact site. The evidence from the Chicxulub crater itself is also extraordinarily detailed. The crater is buried beneath several kilometers of younger sediments, making direct study possible only through deep drilling. Several scientific drilling projects have recovered cores of rock from within the crater, revealing the structure of the impact melt rocks and the breccias, mixed rock types formed by the violent disruption of the target rocks during the impact that fill the crater. The drill cores have been analyzed using a wide range of geochemical and mineralogical techniques, and they have provided important information about the composition of the impactor, the nature of the target rocks, and the sequence of events during and after the impact. The target rocks at Chicxulub are particularly significant for understanding the environmental effects of the impact. The shallow marine sediments of the Yucatan platform that underlay the impact site were rich in carbonates and sulfate minerals, including thick layers of anhydrite and gypsum. When these sulfur-rich rocks were vaporized and dispersed into the atmosphere by the impact, they contributed an enormous quantity of sulfur dioxide to the global atmosphere. Estimates of the amount of sulfur dioxide released by the vaporization of the Yucatan sulfate rocks range into the hundreds of billions of tons, a quantity that would have produced a dense global cloud of sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. The significance of the sulfate aerosols is their role in blocking incoming solar radiation. Sulfate aerosols are very efficient scatterers of visible light, and a global cloud of aerosols in the stratosphere would have substantially reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. Combined with the dust from the impact itself and the soot from global wildfires ignited by the re-entering ejecta, the reduction in solar radiation reaching the surface may have been severe and prolonged. The specific duration and magnitude of this reduction, the length and depth of the impact winter, is difficult to determine with precision from the geological record. But various models and analyses suggest that the effects on global photosynthesis may have been substantial for months to a few years after the impact. The evidence from the biological record at the boundary is consistent with a period of severely reduced photosynthesis. In many marine sections across the world, the KPG boundary is marked by what is called the Strangelove Ocean, a term used by researchers to describe the collapse of surface ocean biological productivity at the boundary. In the deep-sea sediment record, This collapse is visible as a sudden change in the carbon isotope ratio of the carbonate material, from values characteristic of normal biological productivity to values more typical of the deep ocean, which lack the enrichment of the lighter carbon isotope that biological productivity normally produces. Now, this change in carbon isotope ratio indicates that the biological communities of the surface ocean, the photosynthesizing phytoplankton, and the organisms that fed on them, collapsed essentially instantaneously at the boundary and then recovered slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. The pattern of survival in the marine realm provides additional insight into the mechanisms of the extinction. The organisms that survived the end Cretaceous event in the ocean tended to share certain characteristics. Many of the survivors were able to persist in reduced, resting, or dormant states during the period of environmental disruption. Some could feed on the organic matter that accumulated in the water as the organisms of the surface ocean died and sank. Some had the capacity to exploit resources at the seafloor rather than depending on the surface productivity. The organisms that did not survive, particularly the ammonites and many groups of calcareous plankton, appear to have been more tightly dependent on a continuous supply of photosynthetic productivity and less able to persist through a period of its severe reduction. On land, the evidence for a period of dramatically reduced plant productivity at the boundary is found in the pollen and spore record preserved in boundary sediments at many sites. Below the boundary in many sections, fossil pollen assemblages are diverse and reflect the rich angiosperm-dominated plant communities of the late Cretaceous. At the boundary itself, there is often a dramatic reduction in angiosperm pollen and a corresponding increase in fern spores, a pattern called the fern spike. This fern spike represents the rapid colonization of devastated landscapes by ferns, which are pioneer plants capable of rapid establishment in disturbed conditions from spores that can survive unfavorable conditions, before the slower-growing flowering plants could re-establish themselves from seeds. The fern spike is visible in many terrestrial boundary sections in the northern hemisphere, and it indicates that the plant communities of the late Cretaceous were severely disrupted at the boundary, with a rapid and massive die-off of the dominant angiosperm vegetation, followed by the colonization of surviving ferns. The recovery of the flowering plant communities appears to have taken thousands to tens of thousands of years, a geologically brief but ecologically significant period during which the food resources available to large plant-eating animals were severely limited. The mechanism by which the collapse of plant productivity translated into the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs involves the ecophysiology of these animals, their metabolic requirements, and their dependence on continuous food supply. The question of whether dinosaurs were warm-blooded or cold-blooded, or something in between, has been one of the most extensively discussed topics in vertebrate paleontology over the past several decades, and the answer has important implications for understanding the dinosaur extinction. The evidence from bone microstructure, from growth rate studies, and from stable isotope analyses of dinosaur bones has established that most non-avian dinosaurs had growth rates and metabolic levels intermediate between those of modern reptiles, which are ectothermic and have relatively low metabolic rates, and modern birds and mammals, which are endothermic and have relatively high metabolic rates. This intermediate condition, sometimes described as mesothermy, means that the non-avian dinosaurs required significantly more food than modern reptiles of comparable size, but somewhat less than modern mammals of comparable size. The significance of this for the extinction story is that even a relatively modest level of metabolic demand, when applied to a large body, requires a substantial continuous food supply. A large theropod dinosaur like Tyrannosaurus, with a body mass of perhaps 6 to 8 metric tons, would have required a very large amount of food to maintain its body functions and growth, even if its metabolic rate was lower than that of a comparable-sized mammal. When the food chain that supported these large animals collapsed as a result of the failure of plant productivity, the large dinosaurs would have found their food supplies depleted very rapidly, with no ability to enter dormancy or reduce their metabolic requirements sufficiently to survive an extended period of food scarcity. The smaller animals that survived the end Cretaceous extinction, the early mammals and the birds, had several advantages in this scenario. Their smaller body size meant that they required less food in absolute terms. Many were capable of exploiting food resources that remained available even when fresh plant material was scarce, including seeds, which can remain viable in the soil for extended periods, dormant insects and other invertebrates, and the remains of dead animals. Some may have been capable of seasonal torpor or reduced activity that allowed them to reduce their metabolic requirements during the period of food scarcity. The birds present a particularly interesting case for understanding the extinction. Birds are avian dinosaurs, direct descendants of the theropod dinosaurs of the Mesozoic, and they are, in the most accurate biological sense, living dinosaurs. The survival of birds through the KPG extinction, while all other dinosaurs perished, was not a random event, but a reflection of the particular characteristics of birds that differentiated them from their non-avian relatives. Birds in the latest Cretaceous were diverse and ecologically varied, but many of the groups that survived into the Paleogene appear to have had dietary preferences for seeds or small invertebrates, food resources that persisted through the period of plant community collapse more effectively than fresh vegetation. The birds that did not survive the extinction were, in many cases, the more specialized forms, those adapted to particular food sources or ecological niches that were severely disrupted by the environmental changes at the boundary. The toothed birds, for example, which were a diverse group in the Cretaceous, did not survive into the Paleogene. The surviving birds were the ancestors of the modern avian groups, which diversified enormously in the Paleogene as the post-extinction world opened up ecological opportunities that had previously been filled by non-avian dinosaurs. The mammals that survived the extinction also diversified rapidly in the aftermath, a process that began in the earliest Paleogene and continued through the first several million years of the Paleocene epoch. The earliest Paleogene mammals were generally small, and many of them were generalist omnivores, capable of exploiting whatever food resources were available in the recovering ecosystems. As plant communities recovered and diversified, the mammals that depended on them also diversified, with new lineages of herbivores and carnivores filling the ecological roles that had previously been occupied by the non-avian dinosaurs. The recovery of terrestrial ecosystems after the KPG extinction was a prolonged process measured in millions of years rather than thousands. The first few million years of the Paleocene epoch were characterized by ecosystems that were relatively low in diversity and dominated by generalist species, as the surviving lineages radiated into the empty ecological space. The forests that recovered were initially different in composition from those of the late Cretaceous, with different plant species dominating as the angiosperm communities reassembled from whatever seeds and rootstocks had survived the boundary event. The animal communities were similarly reconstituted from survivors, with mammals quickly diversifying to fill herbivore niches that had previously been occupied by hadrosaurs and ceratopsians. The patterns of recovery from the KPG extinction have been studied in detail at several fossil localities where the boundary and the overlying Paleocene sediments are particularly well preserved. The Williston Basin of North Dakota in North America is one such locality, where the Hell Creek Formation, which contains the remains of the latest Cretaceous dinosaurs and other organisms, is overlain by the Fort Union Formation, which records the earliest Paleocene ecosystems. The transition from the Hell Creek to the Fort Union formations records the shift from a dinosaur-dominated world to a mammal-dominated world in remarkable detail, with the fossil record showing the abrupt disappearance of the non-avian dinosaurs. But the fern spike, the recovery of plant communities, and the rapid diversification of mammals in the early Paleocene. The Hell Creek Formation is one of the most intensively studied geological formations in the world because it records the latest Cretaceous world with extraordinary richness and detail. Thousands of specimens of dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, and many other species, have been recovered from Hell Creek rocks, along with the remains of fish, turtles, crocodilians, lizards, snakes, birds, and mammals. The rich fauna of the Hell Creek provides the most detailed picture available of any latest Cretaceous terrestrial ecosystem, and its comparison with the early Paleocene fauna that replaced it gives the clearest picture of the ecological reorganization that followed the extinction. The studies of the Hell Creek and Fort Union formations have consistently shown that the non-avian dinosaurs were abundant and ecologically dominant right up to the very end of the Cretaceous, with no clear evidence of a prolonged decline preceding the extinction. The most detailed analyses of the Hell Creek record, using data from thousands of fossil specimens collected over many decades, have found no compelling evidence for a gradual decline in dinosaurian diversity or abundance in the last million years of the Cretaceous before the boundary. The disappearance of the non-avian dinosaurs at the boundary is essentially instantaneous in geological terms, consistent with the abrupt environmental disruption expected from the Chicxulub impact. The pattern of survival at the KPG boundary in freshwater ecosystems is also informative. Freshwater ecosystems, populated by fish, turtles, crocodilians, and aquatic invertebrates, pass through the boundary relatively well compared to terrestrial and marine ecosystems, with higher rates of survival for most groups. This relative resilience of freshwater ecosystems is thought to reflect the buffering capacity of freshwater bodies, which can accumulate large quantities of organic matter that can sustain aquatic food chains during periods when surface productivity is reduced. Dead plants and animals falling into rivers and lakes provide a food base for detritivores and scavengers, which in turn support the larger animals of the freshwater ecosystem. The survival of the crocodilians, which are large semi-aquatic reptiles with relatively high food requirements for their size, is often cited as a puzzle in the context of the KPG extinction, since the non-avian dinosaurs, some of which had lower metabolic requirements than crocodilians, did not survive. The most likely explanation for this apparent inconsistency is that the crocodilians were buffered by their semi-aquatic lifestyle, and the relative resilience of freshwater food chains, which allowed them to persist through the period of terrestrial food chain collapse. The crocodilians of the latest Cretaceous were also somewhat different in their ecology from those of today, with a greater diversity of terrestrial or semi-terrestrial forms, and it may be that the more terrestrial crocodilian lineages did not survive the extinction as well as the more fully aquatic ones. The marine ecosystem recovery after the KPG extinction followed a pattern somewhat different from the terrestrial recovery. The collapse of the surface ocean productivity at the boundary was severe, but the diversity of surviving organisms in the ocean, from bacteria and phytoplankton to various animal groups, provided the raw material for a relatively rapid initial recovery of marine food chains. The deep ocean, which is less dependent on surface productivity than the shallow ocean, may have provided a refuge for some organisms during the period of surface productivity collapse. The ammonites, which had been among the most abundant and diverse invertebrates in the Mesozoic ocean, did not survive the KPG extinction. Their disappearance is one of the most striking features of the marine extinction record, because ammonites had survived every previous major extinction event in their very long history, stretching back to the Devonian period. Their failure to survive the KPG event, while their close relatives, the nautiloids, did survive, has been the subject of considerable research. The most likely explanation involves differences in the reproductive biology of the two groups, with ammonites having small planktonic larvae that would have been highly vulnerable to the collapse of surface ocean productivity, while nautiloids appear to have had larger eggs and more direct development, making them less dependent on surface productivity for the earliest stages of their life cycle. The selectivity of the KPG extinction in the ocean as on land reflects the particular nature of the environmental disruption caused by the Chicxulub impact. The disruption was primarily to photosynthetic productivity, the foundation of most food chains, and the organisms most vulnerable to this disruption were those most tightly dependent on a continuous supply of photosynthetic productivity for their food supply, especially those at the juvenile and larval stages of their life cycles, which are typically most sensitive to food limitation. The organisms that survived were those with characteristics that buffered them against this specific form of environmental stress. The study of the KPG extinction has benefited enormously from the development of high-resolution stratigraphic analysis, the ability to date and correlate rock sections with very high precision and to analyze the chemical and biological content of thin intervals of rock in great detail. High-resolution analysis of KPG boundary sections has revealed that the extinction was not simply an instantaneous event followed by a gradual recovery, but a more complex process with multiple phases. The initial impact-related environmental disruption caused the immediate collapse of many populations, but the subsequent recovery of ecosystems was influenced by multiple factors, including the rate of recovery of photosynthetic productivity, the availability of surviving organisms to repopulate vacant ecological niches, and the ongoing effects of the Deccan Traps volcanism. The question of the role of the Deccan Traps in the end Cretaceous extinction is one that continues to be actively investigated. The Deccan eruptions were occurring both before and after the KPG impact, and the question of whether the volcanic activity contributed significantly to the extinction, independently of or in interaction with the impact, has been examined from multiple angles. The most recent analysis of the timing and magnitude of the Deccan eruptions suggests that the eruptions before the impact may have caused some degree of environmental stress in the latest Cretaceous, contributing to a world that was somewhat less ecologically stable than it would otherwise have been. The impact then provided the acute catastrophic disruption that caused the mass extinction, and the continued Deccan eruptions after the impact may have delayed or complicated the recovery of ecosystems in the earliest Paleogene. The relationship between large igneous province volcanism and mass extinctions is a recurring theme in the geological record. At the end Permian extinction, the most severe in the history of complex life, was associated with the Siberian traps, another enormous episode of flood volcanism. The end Triassic extinction was associated with the Central Atlantic magmatic province. The correlation between large igneous provinces and extinction events is not perfect, and the causal mechanisms are complex and varied, but the general pattern suggests that massive volcanism represents a major stressor for life on Earth, capable of producing significant ecological disruption through its effects on atmospheric chemistry and global climate. The combination of the Chicxulub impact and the Deccan Traps volcanism at the end of the Cretaceous thus represents an extraordinarily unfortunate convergence of two independent sources of severe environmental stress, in each of which might have caused significant ecological disruption on its own, but which together produced the most severe mass extinction since the end Permian event. The non-avian dinosaurs, as the dominant large-bodied animals of the late Cretaceous terrestrial world, were particularly vulnerable to this combination of stresses, and their extinction, while representing an enormous loss of biological diversity in one sense, also opened the ecological space that allowed the subsequent explosive diversification of the mammals and the birds in the Paleogene. The world above the KPG boundary, the world of the Paleogene, was in many ways a different planet from the world below it. The large, spectacular dinosaurs were gone. The ammonites and mosasaurs were gone. The landscape and the sea were populated by the survivors, smaller and in many cases less specialized than the animals they replaced, but carrying within them the potential for the diversification that would eventually produce the rich biological communities of the modern world. The story of what really killed the dinosaurs is thus not a single cause, but a convergence of causes, operating at different timescales and through different mechanisms, but ultimately producing a singular result: the end of the most successful terrestrial vertebrate dynasty in the history of the Earth. The abrupt and complete disappearance of the non-avian dinosaurs at the KPG boundary after more than 160 million years of dominance stands as one of the most important events in the history of life. And its study continues to illuminate the mechanisms by which planetary-scale catastrophes interact with the biological world to produce the great transitions in the history of life. The recovery from the KPG extinction, the Paleogene world that rose from the ruins of the Cretaceous, is a story of extraordinary biological creativity, of lineages that had been constrained for millions of years by the dominance of the dinosaurs suddenly finding themselves in a world without their former constraints. And from that recovery, the mammals and the birds diversified into the biological world that we know today, carrying with them the evolutionary legacy of the long Mesozoic past. The world that emerged from the ecological collapse of the KPG boundary was, in its earliest stages, a world of relative simplicity. The rich, complex ecosystems of the latest Cretaceous, built over tens of millions of years of evolution and ecological interaction, had been severely disrupted, and the process of rebuilding them from the surviving components was a slow and uneven one. The earliest Paleocene, the geological epoch that began with the KPG boundary and lasted until approximately 56 million years ago, was in many respects a time of recovery, of damaged and impoverished ecosystems gradually reassembling themselves from what had survived. The plant communities of the earliest Paleocene were simpler and less diverse than those of the late Cretaceous. The dominant vegetation in many regions was dominated by pioneer species, ferns, and other plants capable of rapid establishment in disturbed conditions, along with opportunistic flowering plants capable of quick colonization from seeds. The dense, diverse angiosperm-dominated forests of the late Cretaceous recovered gradually over thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. As the various plant species that had survived the boundary event re-established themselves and the ecosystems they supported rebuilt their complexity. The pattern of plant community recovery after the KPG extinction has been studied in detail using the fossil pollen and spore record. In North America, where the record is particularly well studied, the recovery from the fern spike of the immediate boundary interval involved a gradual increase in the diversity and abundance of angiosperm pollen, reflecting the reestablishment of flowering plant communities. The earliest post-boundary plant communities were different in composition from the latest Cretaceous communities, with some plant groups recovering more rapidly than others, and with the relative abundances of different species shifting as the recovery proceeded. By the later Paleocene, several million years after the boundary, the plant communities of many regions had recovered to a level of diversity comparable to those of the late Cretaceous, though their species composition was different, reflecting both the ecological changes produced by the extinction and the evolutionary changes that had occurred in plant lineages in the aftermath. The forests of the later Paleocene and the subsequent Eocene epoch were in many respects the most lush and productive in the history of the planet, as the warmth of the early Paleogene, which was among the warmest periods in the history of the Cenozoic, supported dense tropical and subtropical forest across much of the world, including regions that today have temperate or even Arctic climates. The recovery of animal communities in the terrestrial realm was similarly gradual, proceeding from the diverse survivors of the extinction through successive stages of diversification as the ecological opportunities provided by the recovery of plant communities were exploited by evolving mammalian and avian lineages. The earliest Paleocene mammals were predominantly small, generalist forms, with body masses typically below a kilogram and dietary preferences that were varied and flexible. These small generalists gave rise through rapid evolutionary diversification to the diverse array of mammalian orders that characterize the Paleocene and Eocene. The speed of mammalian diversification after the KPG extinction has been the subject of considerable research using both the fossil record and molecular phylogenetics, the study of evolutionary relationships through the analysis of genetic sequences in living animals. The molecular clock analyses of mammalian evolution suggest that many of the major lineages of modern mammals, the ancestors of the groups that today include the rodents, the primates, the carnivores, the ungulates, and others, had their origins in the Cretaceous before the KPG extinction. This conclusion, if correct, means that the ancestors of these modern groups were already present as distinct lineages when the extinction occurred, and that the extinction did not cause the initial divergence of these lineages, but rather the removal of the ecological constraints that had previously limited their body size and ecological diversity. The fossil record of the earliest Paleocene, does not yet show the large-bodied representatives of these modern orders. The early Paleocene mammals are almost uniformly small, and the large-bodied ecological roles that had previously been filled by the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians and other large herbivorous dinosaurs and by the tyrannosaurid and other large carnivorous dinosaurs were initially vacant. The filling of these large-bodied ecological roles by mammals took time, measured in millions of years, as the mammalian lineages evolved successively larger body sizes through the accumulation of many generations of evolutionary change. The archaic mammals of the Paleocene, the groups that flourished in the immediate aftermath of the extinction before being replaced by the modern orders in the Eocene, included some animals that reached modest large body sizes by the later Paleocene, tens of millions of years after the KPG boundary. The condylarths, for example, a loosely defined group of archaic ungulate-like mammals, included forms that reached perhaps 100 to 200 kilograms by the late Paleocene, roughly comparable to a modern sheep or pig. These were not as large as the great dinosaurian herbivores they had replaced, but they represent the beginning of the trend toward larger body size in post-Cretaceous mammals. The tempo of mammalian body size evolution after the KPG extinction has been studied using data from hundreds of fossil mammal specimens across the Paleocene and Eocene. These studies have found that the increase in maximum body size in the mammalian fauna after the extinction proceeded at a rate that was geologically rapid, but still measured in millions of years. The maximum body sizes achieved by mammals in the Paleocene were substantially larger than those of latest Cretaceous mammals, but still well below those of the large dinosaurs. The giant mammals of the later Eocene and Oligocene, including the early relatives of elephants and the large perissodactyls, like the extinct Paraceratherium, a hornless relative of rhinos that was among the largest land mammals ever to have lived, represented a further increase in mammalian body size that took tens of millions of years to develop. The birds, meanwhile, diversified rapidly in the earliest Paleogene, filling some of the ecological roles left vacant by the non-avian dinosaurs. Some of the earliest Paleogene birds were large, flightless predators called phorusrhacids or terror birds, which occupied the ecological role of large cursorial predator in South America, a role that in other continents was eventually filled by mammalian carnivores. In the Northern Hemisphere, large flightless predatory birds also appeared in the earliest Paleogene, including the diatrymus, which were among the largest animals in the early Paleocene ecosystems of North America and Europe. The rapid ecological radiation of birds in the earliest Paleogene reflects the particular advantages of the avian body plan in the post-extinction world. Birds are capable of flight, which allows rapid colonization of new areas and escape from environmental stresses. They are typically small enough to have low absolute food requirements while being capable of high metabolic rates that support active, intelligent behavior. They can exploit a wide range of food resources, from seeds and fruits to invertebrates to vertebrates. These characteristics made birds among the most versatile and successful survivors of the KPG extinction, and the diversity of modern birds, with approximately 10,000 living species, reflects the enormous ecological radiation that the avian lineage underwent in the 66 million years since the extinction. The marine ecosystem also recovered over the millions of years after the KPG extinction, with the ecological roles vacated by the ammonites, mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs gradually being filled by new groups. The bony fish diversified to fill some of the niches previously occupied by marine reptiles. New groups of calcareous plankton colonized the surface ocean and rebuilt the biological productivity that had been devastated at the boundary. And the mammals, which had already returned to the sea in some lineages before the end of the Mesozoic, began the more extensive radiation that would eventually produce the whales, dolphins, seals, and sea lions of the modern ocean. The return of mammals to the sea is one of the most striking evolutionary transitions of the Paleogene, and it produced some of the largest animals ever to have lived. The earliest ancestors of the whales appear in the fossil record approximately 53 to 55 million years ago, as semi-aquatic mammals closely related to the ancient ancestors of modern even-toed ungulates. Over the subsequent tens of millions of years, these ancestral whales gradually became more fully marine, losing the ability to move on land and developing the streamlined bodies and specialized anatomical features of modern cetaceans. By the Miocene epoch, the ocean was populated by whales that were approaching or exceeding the body sizes of the largest Mesozoic marine reptiles. The evolution of the great baleen whales, including the blue whale that is the largest animal known to have ever lived, was made possible by the particular ecological conditions of the Cenozoic Ocean, with its productive upwelling zones and dense concentrations of krill and other small marine organisms. This evolutionary pathway was not available to the Mesozoic marine reptiles, which were active predators dependent on the pursuit of individual prey items. The baleen whale strategy, deed of filter feeding on dense concentrations of tiny prey, represents a novel solution to the challenge of large body size in the ocean, one that could not have developed in the Mesozoic world, but that became available in the reorganized ecosystems of the Cenozoic. The story of the KPG extinction and its aftermath is therefore not simply a story of destruction and loss, though it was certainly both of those things. It is also a story of opportunity, of the opening of ecological space, and the subsequent diversification of surviving lineages into that space, producing biological communities that were in some ways as diverse and ecologically complex as those of the Mesozoic, but organized differently and built from different evolutionary materials. The world that emerged from the KPG extinction was not better or worse than the world that preceded it in any simple sense. It was different, shaped by a different set of evolutionary and ecological histories, and it is the world from which the modern biological communities of the Earth, including the mammals and birds and flowering plants and insects that dominate the terrestrial world today, are derived. The study of the KPG extinction and the recovery that followed it has implications beyond the specific events of 66 million years ago. It provides a natural experiment in how complex ecological systems respond to catastrophic disruption, and the lessons of that experiment are relevant to the understanding of ecological dynamics more broadly. The patterns of survival and extinction at the KPG boundary, the role of body size and metabolic rate and dietary flexibility in determining which organisms survived, the sequence of ecological recovery as surviving lineages diversified into vacant niches, all of these patterns have counterparts in the responses of modern ecosystems to environmental perturbation. The KPG extinction also illustrates the contingency of evolutionary history, the way in which chance events can redirect the trajectory of life on Earth in ways that could not have been predicted from the prior state of the system. The Chicxulub impactor struck the Earth at a particular place and at a particular time, and the particular characteristics of the target rocks at that place, with their unusual richness in sulfur-bearing minerals, appear to have been important in determining the severity of the environmental disruption that resulted. Had the impactor struck a different part of the Earth's surface, one with less sulfur-rich rocks, the environmental effects might have been less severe, and the pattern of extinction and survival might have been different. This contingency extends to the evolutionary history of the survivors. The mammals that diversified in the Paleogene did so from the particular starting points provided by the late Cretaceous mammalian fauna, a fauna that was itself the product of the long evolutionary history of the mammalian lineage through the Mesozoic. The particular characteristics of the Cretaceous mammals, their small body size, their dietary flexibility, their reproductive physiology, that all of these characteristics were the products of a long evolutionary history, shaped by their particular ecological situation as small, subordinate animals in a world dominated by dinosaurs. These characteristics happen to be advantageous in the post-KPG world, but this advantage was not something that had been selected for in anticipation of the extinction. It was a consequence of the evolutionary history of the group, a history shaped by circumstances very different from those that would prevail in the aftermath of the extinction. The contingency of the evolutionary trajectory that produced the modern world is a fundamental aspect of the history of life that is easy to overlook when examining the history from the perspective of its outcomes. For the biological world as it exists today is not the inevitable product of some predetermined direction of evolutionary change. It is one particular outcome among many that are possible, shaped by the specific sequence of events that actually occurred, including the chance event of the Chicxulub impact 66 million years ago. The thin layer of altered rock at the KPG boundary is thus a marker not only of the end of the dinosaurs, but of a major fork in the path of evolutionary history, a moment after which the world was reorganized in ways that made the subsequent development of the mammal-dominated biosphere possible. The non-avian dinosaurs that perished at that boundary were not failures. They were extraordinarily successful animals that had dominated the terrestrial world for more than 160 million years, a tenure of ecological dominance far exceeding that of any mammalian group. Their extinction was not a consequence of any inadequacy in their biology or any superiority of the mammals that replaced them. It was a consequence of the particular nature of the environmental disruption produced by the Chicxulub impact, a disruption that specifically disadvantaged large-bodied animals with high food requirements, and the non-avian dinosaurs were, as the dominant large-bodied animals of their time, the most vulnerable to that specific type of stress. The avian dinosaurs, the birds, survived precisely because they retained characteristics, small body size, dietary flexibility, and the behavioral capacity for wide dispersal that differentiated them from their non-avian relatives and buffered them against the impact-related food chain collapse. The birds are the living legacy of the dinosaurian lineage, carrying into the present the evolutionary heritage of the group that dominated the Mesozoic terrestrial world. In the 10,000 species of birds alive today, in their extraordinary diversity of forms and behaviors, the deep history of the dinosaur lineage continues, transformed by 66 million years of post-KPG evolution, but still connected, through an unbroken chain of ancestors, to the animals that first appeared in the Middle Triassic of South America more than 230 million years ago. The study of the KPG extinction has also contributed to the broader understanding of mass extinctions in the geological record and their role in the history of life. The recognition that the KPG event was caused primarily by the impact of a large extraterrestrial body was initially controversial, but is now supported by an overwhelming body of evidence, and it has stimulated research into the frequency and consequences of large impacts throughout Earth history. The geological record preserves evidence of numerous other large impacts, and while none of the others is as clearly linked to a major mass extinction as the Chicxulub impact, the potential for impacts to cause significant ecological disruption has been established as an important factor in the long-term history of life on Earth. The 5 major mass extinctions of the Phanerozoic, the End-Ordovician, the Late Devonian, the End-Permian, the End-Triassic, and the End-Cretaceous might represent the most severe episodes of biological loss in the history of complex animal life, and each has been associated with significant changes in the physical environment of the Earth, from glaciation to volcanism to impact. The End Cretaceous is unique among these events in having a clear and well-documented extraterrestrial cause, though, as noted, the contemporaneous Deccan Traps volcanism may have contributed to the environmental stress of the boundary interval. The general pattern across all 5 major mass extinctions is of severe environmental disruption, rapid and widespread biological loss, and slow ecological recovery over millions of years. The recovery from each extinction involved the diversification of the surviving lineages into the ecological spaces vacated by the extinct groups, producing new biological communities that were in some cases very different from those that had preceded the extinction, and that set the biological world on a new evolutionary trajectory. The history of life on Earth is, in part, a history of these successive reorganizations of biological communities repeatedly disrupted by major environmental events and rebuilt from whatever survived. The recognition of this pattern has profound implications for understanding the nature of biological diversity and its long-term dynamics. Biological diversity is not a static property of the living world, but a dynamic one, shaped continuously by the interplay of evolutionary diversification and ecological extinction, with the major mass extinctions representing the most severe and rapid episodes of extinction in the long history of the interplay. The biological communities of the present are, in this perspective, the latest chapter in a very long story of successive disasters and recoveries, each one reshaping the biological world and creating the conditions for the next chapter. The question of what really killed the dinosaurs thus opens into a much larger set of questions about the nature of life on Earth, about the mechanisms by which catastrophic environmental events produce mass extinctions, about the characteristics that determine which organisms survive and which do not, about the processes of ecological and evolutionary recovery after extinction, and about the contingency of the evolutionary trajectories that produce the biological world at any given moment. The answers to these questions are not simple, and they have required many decades of careful research to develop, from the initial observation of the iridium anomaly at the KPG boundary, through the discovery and characterization of the Chicxulub crater, and the detailed study of the extinction record in the fossil record and in the geochemical signatures preserved in boundary rocks. The understanding of the KPG extinction continues to develop as new methods and new data are brought to bear on the evidence, and there are aspects of the story that remain subjects of active research and ongoing refinement. What is clear from the accumulated evidence of more than 4 decades of intensive research since the Alvarez hypothesis was first proposed is that the non-avian dinosaurs were killed by a combination of catastrophic and rapid environmental disruption produced primarily by the impact of a large asteroid at Chicxulub, possibly exacerbated by the concurrent Deccan Traps volcanism that collapsed the photosynthetic foundation of the global food web and produced conditions of food scarcity that large-bodied, food-dependent animals could not survive. The selectivity of the extinction, with small-bodied, dietary flexible animals surviving while large specialized ones perished, reflects the specific nature of this environmental disruption. The non-avian dinosaurs that perished were, in every measurable sense, successful and well-adapted animals that had thrived in the late Cretaceous world. Their extinction was not a consequence of competitive inferiority or evolutionary inadequacy, but of an event of planetary scale that was, from the perspective of any individual organism, entirely unpredictable and entirely beyond any capacity to adapt. But the world was changed, catastrophically and suddenly by geological standards, and the animals of the old world were largely incompatible with the requirements of the new one. The world that followed, the world of the Paleogene and the Neogene and the Quaternary, the world of the mammals and the birds and the flowering plants, is the world that was made possible by that catastrophic change. It is a world shaped by the long history of the Mesozoic, because the evolution of the modern world proceeded from the Mesozoic survivors, but it is a different world, organized differently and inhabited by different dominant organisms because of the events of 66 million years ago. The boundary layer in the rock record, that thin line of iridium-enriched sediment that marks the KPG transition, is a quiet thing. A centimeter or two of altered chemistry in a cliff face, noticed now by geologists and paleontologists who know what it means but invisible to any casual observer. Yet it marks one of the most significant transitions in the history of life on this planet, a moment when the long-established order of the biological world was overturned and a new order began to assemble itself from the surviving pieces. Below that layer, the Mesozoic world, old and rich and dinosaur-dominated, its fossils now speaking only through the patient work of those who excavate and study them. Above it, the Cenozoic world, the world leading by slow steps and many millions of years to the biological communities of the present, the world in which the mammals diversified into horses and whales, and bats and elephants and primates. The world in which the birds diversified into eagles and hummingbirds and penguins and parrots. The world in which the flowering plants diversified into the immense variety that covers the land today. The dinosaurs are gone, in one sense, their long reign ended by the stone that fell from the sky 66 million years ago. But in another sense, they are not entirely gone. The birds that fill the world's skies and forests and wetlands and deserts are dinosaurs, evolved from the same lineage that produced Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, carrying in their bones and their blood and their behavior the deep evolutionary heritage of the group. The dinosaurian lineage did not end at the KPG boundary. It was pruned severely, reduced from its former diversity to a single surviving branch, the birds. But that branch has flourished with extraordinary success in the 66 million years since the boundary, producing a diversity of species that rivals and, in some measures, exceeds that of the non-avian dinosaurs at the height of their Mesozoic diversity. The story of what really killed the dinosaurs is therefore also, and perhaps most importantly, a story about what survived and what the survivors made of the world that the extinction left behind. The catastrophe of 66 million years ago was real and severe, a planetary-scale disruption that ended the lives of countless individual organisms and the evolutionary lineages of thousands of species. But it was also, as all extinctions are, the precondition for what came next, for the diversification of the survivors into the world from which they were released, and for the slow reassembly of biological communities that eventually produced the living world of the present. The rock remembers all of it. In the strata below the boundary, the long record of the Mesozoic, the trilobites and the ammonites and the great marine reptiles and the dinosaurs in all their diversity. In the thin boundary layer, the signature of the impact, the iridium and the shocked quartz and the glass spherules and the soot, the chemical fingerprint of the day that changed the world. And in the strata above the boundary, the long record of the Cenozoic, the gradual recovery and diversification of the survivors, the slow building of the world that eventually became the one that exists today. The boundary is a quiet line in the rock, and the rock is very old, and the story it tells is very long. It is the kind of story that rewards patient attention, the kind of story that reveals more the more carefully it is examined, the kind of story whose full depth can only be appreciated by sitting with it in silence for a while and allowing the enormous spans of time it encompasses to settle into understanding. The dinosaurs lived for more than 160 million years. They filled the world with their diversity, from the colossal to the tiny, from the heavily armored to the lightly built, from the large predators to the grazing herds. They shaped the ecosystems of the Mesozoic world as thoroughly as any group of animals has shaped any world, and the world they shaped was in many ways unlike anything that exists today. A warmer, more equable world without polar ice, covered in vegetation that no longer exists, populated by organisms that are known now only from the patient reconstruction of fossil evidence. That world is gone, ended by the impact of a body from beyond the earth, a chance event of extraordinary consequence that redirected the history of life on this planet in ways that could not have been foreseen. The world that followed is the world of the present, a world built from the survivors of that catastrophe, evolved and diversified over 66 million years into the rich and complex biological communities that we know. Both worlds, the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic, the world of the dinosaurs and the world that followed, are part of the same long continuous story of life on Earth, a story that has been unfolding for more than 500 million years and that shows no sign of approaching its end. The boundary between them, that thin line of altered rock and cliff faces across the world, is the most vivid punctuation mark in that long story, the moment where one great sentence ended and another began. And the story continues, as it has always continued, slowly and patiently, written in the rock and the bone and the living tissue of the world, accumulating year by year and century by century into the deep record of everything that has ever been. It is a very old story, and a very long one, and it is still being written in the rock that forms today, in the organisms that live and die today, in the slow accumulation of sediment that will one day be the rock that some future investigator examines, trying to understand the world of now as we try to understand the world of then. The story of the dinosaurs is one chapter in that immense account. A chapter now closed but not forgotten, preserved in the rock and in the bones and in the living descendants that still carry, in their hollow bones and their warm blood and their feathered bodies, the deep memory of all that the dinosaurian lineage was and all that it became. The boundary is quiet, the rock is old, and the story is very long.